On Sunday, the 1st of June 1862, Elijah Coger rose from bed and planned to spend the morning at the creek on his land with his wife. Nancy and their two small children were inside when gunfire erupted, bullets tearing through the house. A group of armed men had materialized outside, appearing without warning. Nancy shouted for Elijah to flee as he attempted to escape the house on foot. A man called Ferguson caught up to him on horseback and fired at him. Elijah raised his arms and spoke, but Nancy could not hear him above the children's screams. Badly injured, he managed to stand, likely fueled by a surge of adrenaline. Gunfire persisted as he dashed toward a fence about 50 yards from the house. With Ferguson and 9 others chasing him, Elijah made it to the fence. As he fought to climb over, Ferguson approached and shot him. When Nancy got to the fence, she knelt beside his corpse, cradling her daddy in her arms, covered in his blood. Upon reaching Elijah, he took a single breath but said nothing. Nancy knelt next to her dead husband, while laughter came from the house. Ferguson and his gang then looted the house, stealing the cooking horse and valuables. Thus begins the horrific tale of Champ Ferguson. The name American Civil War is oddly chosen. By numerous measures, it was anything but civil. The war is frequently depicted as being waged by conventional armies, thousands strong in blue and gray uniforms. They charged across fields, annihilating one another in frontal linear assaults, which did happen. Yet a large portion of the war took the form of irregular guerrilla combat. More accurately, much of the conflict's bloodshed happened away from the famous battlefields among Americans. Especially people in border states were frequently killed on their own land, sometimes even inside their homes. Meanwhile, about 750,000 uniformed soldiers from both the Union and Confederacy lost their lives. Total casualties, including wounded, were reported at twice that figure, 1.5 million overall. Regrettably, as years passed, civilian casualty counts became much harder to determine. Certain sources estimate civilian deaths near 50,000. However, given the U.S. population of only about 31.5 million then, the war's overall casualties were substantial. Many guerrilla fighters were not authorized by either side. They were viewed as outlaw killers with no accountability for their actions. Since both Union supporters and Confederate sympathizers perpetrated these horrors, war crime convictions were rare. Out of just 2 people finally charged and executed for war crimes, one is regarded as the most infamous Confederate guerrilla. Although no research can reveal more about this man than what is documented, the question persists. Why would a mountain farmer, reportedly a devoted husband and father, torture, kill, and mutilate dozens, often in cold blood? Victims included his friends, relatives, unarmed youths, and defenseless men while they slept. After his conviction, was he truly executed, or was there a plot to spare him? Samuel Champ Ferguson was raised in the Cumberland Mountains of southern Kentucky, close to the northeastern Tennessee border. This area was once home to Davy Crockett before the Civil War. For over 2 decades, Ferguson worked as a farmer. He enjoyed hunting, which allowed him to explore the mountains he loved and also provided food for his family. His lengthy trips gave him detailed familiarity with the foothills and peaks. That knowledge proved crucial, allowing him to evade Union guerrillas and federal troops who pursued him tirelessly throughout the war, whether it came from his father or from some other dark part of his psyche. Champ's vicious conduct was evidently notorious even before the conflict, starting with a reported event in 1858. Early that year, a man named Floyd Evans failed to repay a debt on time after buying livestock from Champ. In a rage, Champ hunted down and ambushed Floyd's twin brother, Alex Evans, taking his horse as compensation. Horses were costly and essential for a man's survival and livelihood. Horse theft was regarded as a severe offense, and Floyd settled his obligation in June. Meanwhile, Alex Evans continued his legal action against Champ regarding the stealing of his horse. The Evans siblings started making public statements, and Champ viewed this as a danger to his life. The Fletchers County Court issued a warrant for Ferguson's arrest. Champ pretended not to know about the warrant for his arrest and kept journeying to and from Ventura County. But following a religious camp gathering in August, as he departed, the Fentress County Constable tried to serve the arrest warrant on him. Several men assisted him in this endeavor. When Champ noticed the increasing number of men, he tried to flee by climbing onto his young horse. The men pursued him, hurling stones. His horse tripped, forcing him to escape on foot. Officer Reed was the first to catch up. Champ swiftly drew his pocket knife and started cutting the constable, fatally stabbing him. He then injured Floyd Evans, coming close to killing him, and fled into a neighboring farmhouse. But after being threatened with death by the mob, he gave himself up to the Fentress County Sheriff to ensure a just trial. James Zachary Sr., the local magistrate, ordered that he be jailed. He remained in prison for 2 months until his family posted bail, putting up a substantial portion of their land as collateral. Champ managed to hire a capable lawyer, Scott Bledsoe, though his trial for the murder of Jim Reed was set for the next January. That trial never took place. How he achieved it remains unknown, but Bledsoe apparently succeeded in postponing Champ's trial multiple times before any hearing could occur. Almost 3 years elapsed, and by then the Southern states had withdrawn from the Union. Some believe that either due to Scott Bledsoe's sway or because Champ felt obligated for his help, Champ was motivated to back the Confederacy in the mountain struggle at the war's start. Being the eldest among the Ferguson offspring, Champ now stood in hostile disagreement with his 9 siblings, his mother, and nearly all his acquaintances and neighbors, who all sided with the Union and strongly objected to his support of the Southern cause. This account of American political strife might not be particularly thrilling, just like any other conflict. Gaining insight into the social and political views of that era seems quite essential to comprehend some of the fundamental reasons behind Champ's violent actions. During the 1850s, the argument about expanding slavery into newly acquired Western lands ignited discord between the 2 primary political groups. Those groups were the Whig Party and the Democratic Party. Democrats from the South advocated for extending slavery into every territory, whereas their Northern colleagues believed each territory ought to make its own choice. The Republican Party was established in 1854, just 7 years prior to the beginning of the Civil War. This party was formed by a coalition of anti-slavery Whigs, individuals from the Know-Nothing Party, and various others. The new organization gained increasing backing nationwide, especially in the northern states. Within a short time after its formation, 2 of its presidential candidates won elections. Abraham Lincoln was the first, though he was highly unpopular due to his progressive stance. Even though he obtained less than 40% of the popular vote, the discussion about slavery's future was a major element in the escalating hostilities across the nation. Hoping at first to prevent violent confrontation and keep the Union intact, Lincoln and many in his party did not seem to openly advocate for slavery's abolition, at least before the war began. Yet in certain personal letters, Lincoln admitted his contempt for the hypocrisy of existing in a country that tolerated the unethical institution of slavery, along with the contentious mistreatment of Irish immigrants and Catholics, despite the nation being established on the principle that all men are created equal. In an 1855 letter to Joshua Speed, he stated, "When it reaches this point, I would rather move to a nation that does not pretend to cherish liberty like Russia, for instance, where tyranny is straightforward and untainted by the vile mixture of hypocrisy." Once more, the early dispute concerning slavery was not primarily about its abolition, but rather the argument over allowing slavery in the emerging territories as American pioneers migrated westward, since those farmers without slaves viewed forced labor as an unjust edge. In spite of his real comments, campaign propaganda portrayed Lincoln as a complete abolitionist. And even though he later tried to appease the Southern states by upholding their constitutional right to keep slavery, his election deeply fractured an already unstable country. As the war intensified and prompted Southern states to secede, the Union Army was keen to enlist any man ready to serve. Both runaway and emancipated slaves were eager to battle not just to protect the Union, but also to secure liberty for their enslaved brethren. Frederick Douglass, who had himself fled slavery, was arguably the most well-known abolitionist of that era. He acted as a counselor to Lincoln and debated with him about the equitability of such concepts. The argument that those who fight for their country deserve equal rights in exchange for their service is presented. However, the full story is more complex. Lincoln was influenced by Douglass's advice over a year after the conflict started. After the Union's victory at Antietam in Maryland, Lincoln released a preliminary version of the Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862. This document would liberate slaves in Confederate states if the Union emerged victorious. Thus, political disputes are never straightforward, and this is a key point to remember. Abolition of slavery was not universally backed by Republicans. Conversely, a few Democrats eventually voted for it. Yet, in the South, the whole Republican Party, along with its affiliates and supporters, were branded as abolitionists, even though not all Republicans held that view. In Champ Ferguson's remote mountain area, partisan loyalties often revolved around supporting the end of slavery. That region had few slaves, and partisan allegiances seemed less rooted in intricate arguments and more about picking the victorious faction. People attacked each other solely based on party loyalty, ignoring the finer political details. Champ's family likely feared that the unpaid debt, the large land payment made for his bail, would be forfeited if he fought for the Confederacy instead. Scott Bledsoe might have assured Champ immunity, with a triumphant Confederate regime dropping the charges. During the conflict, Champ allegedly broke into the Fletcher County Courthouse and removed the pages from the minutes book that detailed his murder of Constable Reed, thereby erasing evidence of his offense. No evidence links him to the missing pages, but those pages were indeed gone. After Tennessee seceded in June 1861, East Tennessee was soon a hotspot for unofficial clashes between Union and Confederate partisans. As Champ's actions before the war show, violent confrontations had already taken place there sporadically. With weak law enforcement, mob rule and family feuds prevailed. Disputes often centered on livestock, women, politics, and theft. Yet, the Civil War arguably sparked the most intense divisions. Appalachian mountain culture enforced a primal loyalty code. In the mountains, choosing a side meant severing all connections, and opponents became foes. Family vendettas were waged under the cover of war, and by spring 1862, the Cumberland Mountains were engulfed in violence. Confederate sympathizers who hadn't enlisted fought with local Union backers away from the front. Later, Union troop movements into Tennessee heightened regional tensions. Champ's deep animosity toward Lincoln, the federal government, and Union supporters undoubtedly drove his later violence. With his community seemingly hostile, why did he choose the Confederacy? The motives for his ferocious allegiance remain regrettable. According to reports, Ferguson gave the most plausible reason for backing the South in the war, although it's less glamorous. He claimed he was a Union supporter until he made a deal for his release after killing Constable Reed. He later stated, "When war began, I was persuaded to enlist on the promise that all charges in that case would be dropped. That's why I took up arms." Since he hadn't enlisted then, it's believed he meant his allegiance to Scott Bledsoe and the possible promise of immunity for serving the Confederacy when he made that statement. Champ mainly operated as an unapproved guerrilla, yet he always justified his violence as that of a proper Confederate soldier. He wasn't formally drafted into the Confederate Army until 1864. By 3 years into the war, he had murdered many men. Regarding his early Confederate loyalty, later interviews suggested his commitment solidified after the Confederate win at Bull Run in Virginia. In early summer 1861, that victory convinced him he'd picked the winning side. But by late 1861, Champ Ferguson started a personal vendetta. He killed any civilians, even friends or relatives, he thought backed the Union. Here's a quote from James Johnson of the Nashville Dispatch. Dated the 22nd of October 1865, he spared no one wounded, sick, elderly, or defenseless children from his savage killings. He claimed he believed he was waging legitimate war. We were experiencing a kind of haphazard war across Fentress County, Tennessee, and Clinton County, Kentucky, and the whole area. Every man's life was at risk. If I didn't kill my neighbor, he would kill me. Each of us had between 20 and 50 designated enemies, and killing them any time was seen as acceptable. No matter the location or condition, even if wounded or bedridden, on December 2nd, Champ is said to have taken a horse by gun from a fellow resident. He almost killed the man for allegedly being a Lincoln supporter, a cursed Lincolnite, while 2 Confederate companions were with him. After that, he rode the stolen horse to the residence of his longtime friend Reuben Wood, who was close to the Ferguson family. Wood had known and looked after Champ from birth. He once saved Champ's life by stepping in and stopping a lynch mob from executing him after Champ fatally stabbed the Fentress County constable. Once the war started, Wood became linked with the same Union unit. Jim Ferguson, Champ's younger brother, had signed up. Champ asserted that the two of them intended to kill him whenever they got the chance. Champ and his Confederate companions encountered Wood on the road in front of Wood's house as he came back from feeding his livestock. Wood carried no weapons. As Wood's daughter Elizabeth recalled, Champ exchanged a few casual pleasantries with Wood before suddenly stating, "I imagine you visited Camp Robinson." This wasn't a query. Camp Robinson was a sensitive topic for Confederate sympathizers. They thought that men were enlisted there into the Home Guard, a local Union militia that protected the region. Wood honestly admitted he had been there, and Ferguson inquired about the purpose of his visit. However, as per Wood's daughter, before Wood could answer, Ferguson started using foul and bitter words. He said that only a cursed old Lincolnite would ever be found at a place like that. After ranting for several minutes, Champ aimed his pistol at Reuben. "Don't you plead, Ferguson," he commanded, "and don't you flinch." Wood's wife and daughter watched from the front of the house. Reuben himself pleaded for his life, making an emotional appeal, recalling their long friendship and his having cared for Champ as a baby. "Reuben, you've always acted like a gentleman toward me," Ferguson replied, "but you've been to Camp Robinson, and I plan to kill you." Ferguson fired, striking Reuben in the chest. Yet Reuben was not easy to kill. Despite being mortally wounded, he managed to flee into his house, while his wife and 2 children could do nothing to rescue him. Reuben endured 2 days of agony before dying from his wound. A month later, following the Battle of Mill Springs in mid-January, Ferguson sought out another old acquaintance, William Frog. Esther Frog was on her front porch peeling apples when Champ Ferguson rode up to the house, once more with 2 Confederate companions. Mrs. Frog had no suspicion of trouble. She too had known Champ from childhood and politely invited him to sit and have an apple. Stepping onto the porch, Ferguson ignored her offer and walked deliberately inside. William Frog was ill in bed, with their 5-month-old baby in a nearby crib. As with many of his victims, Frog had no weapon and could not even sit up. He feebly told his uninvited guest that he had a recurrence of measles. Union records indeed indicate he was on medical leave from his unit, although he likely kept that detail from Ferguson. Unfortunately, Ferguson was already aware of his Union ties. "I suppose you contracted the measles at Camp Dick Robinson," Ferguson growled as he lifted his Colt revolver. Without a further word, he pulled the trigger twice as Frog weakly tried to drag the blanket over his face. Following his usual custom after such killings, Champ searched the cabin for weapons and any items of worth before departing. Since Champ's family and community were already pro-Union and opposed to his Confederate stance, the brutal killings of Frog and Wood, along with his brazen stealing of livestock and other offenses, turned the entire countryside against him. Meanwhile, Champ's brother Jim had enlisted as a scout in the Union's 1st Kentucky Cavalry. The brothers were said to have vowed to shoot each other upon sight. That certainly would have occurred if Jim hadn't been ambushed and killed within a month after Reuben Wood's death. Following his father's murder, Reuben Wood's son Robert assembled a small group of armed men specifically to kill Champ Ferguson. They lost their opportunity when Champ promptly escaped southward over the border into secessionist Tennessee. He became part of a pro-Southern guerrilla group led by none other than his previous lawyer, Scott Bledsoe. Even though Champ had relocated his family to Tennessee, he frequently went back to his Kentucky home. For his activities during the war, guerrilla warfare offered an alternative to joining the regular army, allowing fighters to stay near home in known territory for the duration. The idea of sanctioned violence and the absence of military discipline seemed to draw the most unstable and bloodthirsty individuals. A major reason for the guerrillas' brutal effectiveness was their disregard for military conventions, such as in weapon selection. The Colt revolver became preferred among bushwhackers because it gave a tactical edge over rifles in close-quarters combat. At night, the sound of sabers and carbine rifles striking saddles traveled far. Consequently, stealth became a key advantage for guerrillas. While Confederate authorities more often endorsed such tactics, both guerrilla and anti-guerrilla groups also operated for the Union. One such Union defender was as brutal as Champ was for the Confederacy. Dave Beatty, a man from Venturous County, became Champ's mortal enemy. Initially, Beatty was said to be a neutral civilian when the war began. Eventually, Bledsoe's men threatened to kill him unless he joined the Confederacy. In early 1862, Beatty reacted by aligning with the Union and forming his own guerrilla unit. His troops dwelled in the forest just as Ferguson's did, employing equally brutal methods. According to local folklore, Betty once shot a man and then made his horse trample the victim's face. The Nashville Dispatch reported that Betty battled Champ Ferguson throughout the entirety of his career. The two exchanged countless gunfire, each sustaining severe injuries. They were sworn foes who pursued one another with relentless brutality. Betty also gave testimony against Champ at his 1865 trial after the war. Enlisted soldiers from both the Union and Confederacy, irrespective of allegiance, scorned and humiliated these partisan rangers. They labeled them bushwhackers, freebooters, and derogatory names like carpet knights. Yet, this characterization wasn't entirely accurate. Additionally, they were called featherbed soldiers for their seeming reluctance to leave their cozy homes. Meanwhile, cautious fighters and civilians alike evacuated their residences during that time to avoid becoming vulnerable targets. Champ Ferguson exemplified the validity of these fears. He appeared to take pleasure in surprising his foes, forsaking military traditions to massacre them. Over the 4-year conflict, numerous victims were killed while in bed or near their houses. Ferguson killed trained soldiers, Home Guard members, and ordinary farmers. He also executed defenseless captives and the children of those he considered enemies. While he occasionally employed a pistol or rifle, it is said he favored killing at close range using a Bowie knife. Additionally, there were stories of beheadings and mutilation of bodies, like placing severed heads or rolling them down slopes for amusement. Champ later claimed that his knife was his signature. To mark each victim, he supposedly carved a notch into the knife's handle after every murder. He eventually stopped because the handle became too full to carve additional notches. According to the great-great-grandson of Union soldier Elijah Coger, this occurred in late March of early spring 1862. A gathering took place in Monroe, Tennessee, involving residents from Overton County, representing the southern side, and residents from Fentress County, Tennessee, and Clinton County, Kentucky, representing the northern side. Elijah led a unit of Home Guardsmen responsible for monitoring Clinton County. Part of their duty involved tracking Ferguson's movements. Elijah's position in the Home Guard explains his selection as a participant in the peace negotiations. The meeting in Monroe aimed to establish an agreement that would halt raiders from causing destruction in the 3 counties. The gathering proved successful, with both sides promising not to launch raids into neighboring counties. However, it quickly became clear that not all attendees genuinely desired peace. Ferguson, being largely accountable for the raids and fatalities, also attended the meeting. Elijah and the other Union delegates at Monroe were unaware of the depth of Ferguson's hatred for the Union. Champ's animosity was so intense that merely their participation in the peace talks made him want to murder them. They would soon suffer consequences for attempting to restore peace to the area. According to reports, on April 1st, Champ and other members of Bledsoe's group killed 5 men in one day in Fentress County. Several of these victims had been among the Union representatives at the Monroe Peace Conference. The deceased were Joseph Stover, William Johnson, Robert Martin, and Louis Pierce. Champ claimed Stover perished in an exchange of gunfire. Martin and Pierce, presumably unarmed, were shot while attempting to escape. Court records show that 3 of the victims were killed with a double-barrel shotgun and also stabbed in the heart. Johnson, a Union soldier on leave, was staying with his father at the time. Johnson was pursued over a cliff by Bledsoe's men, falling roughly 40 to 50 feet before being shot, though the details of these deaths were disputed. Champ freely admitted to the murders, asserting that the men were Union Home Guards intent on killing him. Nevertheless, his final victim that day wasn't a man, but rather a local teenager named Fount Zachary near Spring Creek, Kentucky. He crossed paths with the 16-year-old Zachary. Due to either a misprint or sensationalist journalism, the Nashville Dispatch later claimed he was as young as 12. Fount was the grandson of James Zachary Sr., the magistrate who had imprisoned Champ for killing Constable Jim Reed before the war. As with many of his other targets, Champ seized this opportunity for vengeance.